Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Cosmos Show, place to be if you're curious about the universe. I'm your host, Dr. Sam, the founder and executive director of Wyoming Stargazing. Here you can pick the brains of astrophysicists, get advice from a space doctor, and learn all about what's up above your head, all in the same place. Join us every other Tuesday, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. So today, let's introduce our co-stars in just a minute. But today's theme is human space exploration. So we'll talk about where we are in human spaceflight, some of the challenges, and some of the more recent accomplishments. And let's get to our co-stars. First, medical doctor and founder of Orbital Biodesign, it's Dr. Danny Carroll.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, Danny. Next, postdoctoral scholar from the Simons Observatory, it's Nick Galitsky.
Hey there.
Hey, Nick. And last but certainly not least, it's a PhD candidate in astrophysics from the University of Chicago and host of her own YouTube show, Nora's Guide to the Galaxy. It's Nora Bailey.
Hey, everyone.
Hey, Nora. And again, Dr. Lauren Corley's isn't able to join us tonight, but she will be back next time in a couple weeks. So tonight, it's Danny's turn to tell us a little bit about what she's been up to. So Danny, we're all yours.
All right, sounds good. So it's good to be here. And just as a little bit of background about me, in case folks are just tuning in for the first time. So I'm a medical doctor, but before going into medicine, I flew airplanes on active duty in the Air Force. And I've kind of circled back around. I've gone through some surgical training and have been pulling that together with some work that I've done with NASA to try to contribute to the larger space medicine community and space surgery community now in a meaningful way. So what I was asked to do today is to present a space health primer. So just to kind of give like a good overview of some of the issues that we're running into in space health, what that means for us logistically and everything moving forward, and why we're worried about the things that we're worried about, big picture. So let's see, next slide, please. All right, yeah, and you can go ahead to the next one. All right, great. So this is just very briefly what we're going to be talking about in the next few minutes. I'll give a quick little intro and then talk about NASA's plans for human spaceflight, talk about the path to the moon and then to Mars, some of the challenges that we're going to be facing, and then that space health primer that I mentioned. Next slide. All right, so thank you. So where are we now and where are we going? Right now, as most of you all are probably aware, we are conducting most of our operations on the International Space Station, which is located in low Earth orbit. And as a result of its current location, we get to enjoy all the benefits of being pretty close to home. So you might have heard about the Artemis program, the slide for which I've got up here now, so NASA's current plan is to go back to the moon in the next 3 to 4 years or so for the first time since the 1960s. So it's pretty exciting stuff. But the broader space community, and especially NASA, as well as now the commercial spaceflight entities, really have their eye on Mars. The timing is still to be determined. I think there are some skeptics that say it's going to be a little farther out than we like, but the bottom line is that we are going. And so as a doc in this environment, one of my jobs is really to figure out how. And the reality is that missions to Mars, as you'll see in a moment, are going to require a complete and total paradigm shift. Yeah, so you can go to the next slide, please. Sorry. A complete and total paradigm shift that's going from augmented, really well-supported, environment in low Earth orbit to an entirely autonomous setup that's going to be required for future Mars missions. All right, next slide. So I just wanted to start by defining aerospace medicine for folks who might be a little bit less familiar. Historically, this is actually a branch of preventative medicine that deals with the clinical and preventative medical requirements of humans in atmospheric flight and in space flight, and in space. And so, historically, there was really a focus on prevention, where we're considering abnormal physiology considering normal physiology in an abnormal environment, which is the exact flip-flop of what we do on Earth. So normally when you go to the doctor, you go with a problem, with what we call a pathologic condition, and but you're in an otherwise normal environment at 1G on the surface of the Earth. So it's the exact opposite in the aerospace environment, where we assume healthy people, normal physiology, but then the environment is what gets a little bit wonky. Next slide, please. And so now what we're really contending with, big picture, is abnormal physiology with longer and longer missions in an abnormal environment. So the longer the mission is, the greater the likelihood that somebody's going to develop some sort of medical condition that we need to contend with. And so what that does is it puts a much larger, much heavier burden on folks like me and other researchers and physicians that are trying to figure out how best to facilitate human spaceflight moving forward. Next slide. So this is a slide of medical conditions that have actually arisen throughout the history of human spaceflight. And I know it's a little bit small, it's probably tiny for that screen. I'm sorry about that. But basically it's listing out a bunch of different things, none of which have been, or the majority of which have been pretty tame. This is current as of 2017. And so I wanted to just put this in here early on to dispel the notion that astronauts are somehow superhuman or immune to the ailments that we learn to treat in medical school, and that doctors treat all over the place. The most frequent categories that you see on this slide are related to space adaptation, so things like space motion sickness, which we'll hopefully touch on if we have time, some back pain issues related to space flight, headaches, nasal congestion, stuff like that. And then the second most common category is really space-associated conditions, things that are related to the spaceflight environment itself. So headaches due to elevated CO2 in the inter-cabin atmosphere. Vision impairment, there's something called space-associated neuroocular syndrome, which we'll talk about. Things like abrasions, burns, et cetera, stuff that you'd see in the primary care officer in your local emergency department. And then the third most common type of medical conditions that you see are really basic stuff that you'd see like in an urgent care facility on Earth. So stuff like mild allergic reactions, sprains, strains, rashes, etc. All right, next slide.
A quick aside on the back pain. It's not like they're lifting anything heavy. What's going on there? Is that just like the vertebrae stretching apart, or?
Yeah, so there are a number of things that are really going on in the musculoskeletal system, in general. And I don't think I hid that slide, so hopefully we'll have a little bit of time to talk about that stuff. But yeah, there's the unloading piece where you're taking away that gravity component, and so there's a little bit of stretching that's involved. And then the longer we stay in flight, your bones are kind of a use it or lose it thing. There's a law called Wolff's Law that basically communicates exactly that. And so if you're not bearing weight, which our bones are used to on Earth, then we have a tendency of seeing bone demineralization. And it's actually at a pretty rapid rate. It's about 1% per month spent in space, which gets becomes a pretty big deal pretty quickly. So anyway, but we'll get there. So, all right, so I'll go through a little bit more history in a moment, but I just wanted to get a few things out of the way. I mentioned, where we are as far as being on the ISS, and then we're planning to put a spacecraft in lunar orbit in the next few years, as I mentioned, establish a deep space gateway, build in the vicinity of the moon, a deep space transport mechanism, and then leapfrog onto Mars. So it's very ambitious, obviously, but that is big picture our plan. Next slide. And so in terms of the history of the last 60 years or so of human spaceflight, as mission duration and complexity have increased, so too have in-flight medical capabilities. And so next slide, please. Yeah. So a simple pack with antiemetics and decongestants were seen on Mercury missions at the very beginning, late 50s and early 60s. Next slide. And then during the Gemini era, we saw a slightly heftier med kit. Next slide. And transitioning to the somewhat intrusive in-flight monitoring capabilities that were pretty famously included in Apollo missions. So you can imagine Tom Hanks in that movie, tearing off the EKG leads, right, in Apollo 13. So that was Apollo era capabilities. Next slide. And then we had the compartmentalized shuttle era kits. And finally, next slide, we had the shift from medical kit to medical system that we've really seen in the last 20 years or so with the ISS. So next slide. And it's interesting because while as physicians, we see this when we think of human spaceflight. Next slide. engineers actually see this, which may seem like it's not a big deal, but as I've learned in my current academic pursuits, I'm trying to become fluent in this language, this engineering piece, but it's very distinctly different from what you learn as a doc. So, with all the mass, power, volume considerations that are involved in putting together missions of this magnitude, to go either to the moon or to Mars, it can be a pretty tough sell sometimes to say, well, we need to bring a really robust medical suite's worth of supplies, so we have to be very judicious about how we're going to approach medical care and really, really careful to pick and choose exactly what things we need and exactly what things we don't. So with that, we'll shift gears and we'll talk mostly about medicine. So, all right, next slide. So right now in flight, ground personnel can actually instruct crew members on all sorts of things. And that happens on a routine, like on a daily basis, essentially. And so that's what we refer to as real-time remote guidance. Ground personnel are constantly training folks and giving direction and guidance on things like ultrasound, OCT, it's ocular coherence tomography, I believe, fundoscopy, looking at the back of the eye, tonometry. And so it's not just images of the eye, even though that's what you're seeing here on the left side of the screen. But there's also live monitoring of how the crew is doing. Again, this is all in the ISS. So we have all these luxuries that folks might not necessarily be aware of, but it's a total game changer on the medical side of things. And then we can also store info and forward it, info on crew performance and, different biometric parameters and stuff. And then that can be analyzed on the ground and turned right back around and used to inform some of the, some of the changes that we might make. Next slide. All right, so we can skip this. We've talked a little bit about this. Next slide. Yeah, so it should come as no surprise that there's really is an exponential increase in the complexity that we'll see with each additional step, right? So NASA plans to first conduct this flyby mission to Mars. Sorry, you can click again, actually. Yeah, thanks. But NASA's planning on doing first a flyby mission to Mars and then ultimately conducting surface operations. And I mean, the complexity of that whole process and of planning for that and gearing up for that is really tremendous. It's actually very exciting from my vantage point, at least. But there's a group at NASA called the Exploratory Medical Capabilities Group, or Exploration Medical Capabilities Group, XMC. And so those folks and others are looking at exploration class missions very specifically, and they've actually narrowed down the 5 most daunting hazards of a mission to Mars to these 5 that you see on the screen here. So radiation, which we'll talk about if we have a little time left later, isolation and confinement, altered gravity fields, hostile or closed environments, and then certainly distance from Earth. And you can click again. Thanks. So how far are we really talking? It's about 225 million kilometers between the Earth and Mars on average. And as you've been hearing over the last several weeks, if you've tuned in, that the whole orbital mechanics and orbital dynamics problem is a very complex one, and it's one that's constantly changing. That's part of what makes it so interesting and cool. But that's so that 225 million kilometers is about an average. And so we're anticipating contending with time delays of about 3 to 4 minutes at least, at a bare minimum, normally closer to 20 minutes or so. And then every few years, there will be something called a solar conjunction where we lose communication entirely with a spacecraft for on the order of a couple of weeks, which is a pretty big deal if you're talking about attempting to do anything close to real-time guidance, in real-time communication with ground folks for medical care. So big changes. All right, next slide. So then the question really becomes, fundamentally, a Mars mission cannot rely on the current operational medical approach because right now it's, as I mentioned, totally dependent on that real-time communication. It requires lots and lots of continuous ground support, requires frequent resupply, which I didn't mention previously, but there are constantly Soyuz modules going back and forth. And it's also dependent on the possibility of evacuation as the ultimate contingency plan for delivery of definitive care. If somebody gets really sick, like develops urosepsis, for example, as we've seen actually on Mir. And so then, next slide. Then the question becomes, how do we build a medical system to meet the needs of an interplanetary mission that is 2 to 3 times as long as any previous mission, more than 500 times as far as any prior mission, and for which evacuation is not an option. So these are some pretty tall orders. But next slide. So sorry for the second eye chart here, But this is the list of about 100 medical conditions that XMC group that I mentioned previously has identified as the most likely to develop in flight. And it's important to note that not all of these have actually occurred before. In fact, very few of them have, but essentially they're the conditions that the greater NASA medical community is working to figure out how to treat on exploration class missions, both to the moon and to Mars. And I should note this list is actually in the process of being revised. And I've had a hand in making sure that some surgical diseases were added to the list, which is a win in my book. So the next slide. It's important to recognize, though, this is, I guess, what you can consider the sobering reality, which is that these 100 conditions are what we're planning for. And then there are a whole boatload that we are not planning for and that we just simply can't, given the mass, power, volume, just other resource limitations, resource constraints. And so that's really that's a reality that as a doc, or as docs, we kind of have to wrap our brains around. So next slide. All right, so shifting gears, big picture, these are the, so that was an overview of the landscape of human health risk in space. And I just wanted to briefly, we don't have too much time left, but maybe if we have time later, we can come back to some of this stuff to talk about some of the biggest problems in space health that are currently really, really big areas of development, study, and or I guess of like research and development moving forward. So you'll notice that in a lot of these cases, these really are similar conditions to what we see on Earth. It's just that they're accelerated by some of the hazards of the spaceflight environment. So conditions might develop earlier than they would have otherwise, like the bone loss thing that I mentioned. So we'll talk about fluid shifts, some vision changes that happen, muscle atrophy, in addition to that the bony changes, bone resorption, nephrolithiasis, it's a fancy way of saying kidney stones. There are some behavioral health, sleep-related issues, cognition issues, fuzzy brain, issues with respect to radiation, some immunologic changes that are actually nonlinear, kind of challenging to quantify in a lot of cases, vascular disease and some clotting problems. And then there's some other issues with respect to the microbiome and the gut in general. So next slide. And actually, maybe I'll just pick out three of these to start with. And then if we have time later, we can go into more detail. So we'll start with fluid shifts. And when you see photos of astronauts in space, you all have probably noticed, and if you compare them to how they look on Earth, you might have noticed that they look a little puffier than usual. So, so down bottom left, that's Dr. Drew Morgan. On the left, very bottom left, that's him on Earth, and then you can see him in space on the right. Next set of pictures over is Story Musgrave. He's a general surgeon and trauma surgeon. So left-hand picture is him on Earth, right-hand picture is him in space. A lot of congestion here, kind of puffiness in the face. Peggy Whitson, same thing. And then here's, one of the recent crews from over the last 2 or 3 years. And pretty much everybody has this puffy face picture. And so what's really happening is over the course of the first 48 to 72 hours after transition from the 1G environment on Earth to the 0G environment, or what we call microgravity in the spaceflight environment, is this overall shift of fluids cephalad, or toward the head and upper torso. Interestingly, it's not just blood, but it's also fluid that moves in the interstitial space, we call it, in the tissues that surround the blood vessels and surround muscles and stuff. So, instead of them being really evenly distributed on Earth, they really do collect up here, which causes a whole host of problems, some of which we don't really fully understand quite yet. But big picture, this actually triggers a cascade of physiologic events. So you have these carotid baroreceptors in your neck, which sense blood pressure. On Earth, they're considered to be, they sense blood pressure all over the body. But in this specific setting, you actually have higher blood pressure here than you do at toward your feet, for example. And so the carotid baroreceptors sense the increased blood pressure, send a signal to your kidneys to say, hey, please get rid of fluid. And so it triggers this diuretic effect. And so the net result is that a lot of folks end up very severely dehydrated in some cases in the spaceflight setting, which causes a whole bunch of different problems. The good news is that it's fully reversible. It resolves on return to Earth. But it's not totally clear quite yet what some of the implications will be on longer and longer missions. So let's see. And actually, I'm in the process of developing a device through my company, Orbital Biodesign, to try to mitigate some of these problems. Next slide. There you go. So I mentioned space-associated or space-flight-associated neuroocular syndrome, or SANS. This was previously called VIP. I think it was visual impairment and increased intracranial pressure. And the reason the name was changed is that it was determined that it's not only related to increased intracranial pressure, it's actually a little bit more complex than that. But some of the changes that we've seen in astronauts' vision after spending time in space are developing what we call optic disc edema. So edema of the, of one of the components of the eye, choroidal folds, which I guess these are kind of complex medical terms, but the bottom line is that we see a picture that resembles, not just increased intracranial pressure, but probably increased, so like on the cerebrospinal fluid side, but also on the vascular side. So there are multiple fluids involved that are becoming congested. And that creates this really complicated picture to say, okay, how do we fix it? We actually have seen some folks become farsighted, have a hyperopic shift as much as plus 175, which can take somebody who previously never needed glasses, and all of a sudden they do need to wear glasses. So, and interestingly, across the astronaut population, approximately 80% wear vision correction at this point. All right, next slide, please. So there really are, and maybe we'll probably stop here for right now. And then if we have time later, we can come back to medical stuff. I could talk about this all day, but I don't want to steal all the time. So there really are 5 primary proposed explanations for why these changes occur. I mentioned the fluid shift piece, increased intracranial pressure, ICP. We see moderate increases in ICP on post-flight, so after landing lumbar punctures, but these have not been done very consistently. And so, that's one of the things that we're actually hoping now that we're going to be able to leverage some, additional capabilities on the commercial spaceflight side, is to say, hey, maybe there are some folks who'd be interested in contributing to the body of knowledge surrounding human spaceflight by, undergoing a lumbar puncture in flight or something. So there may be a component of decreased cerebrospinal fluid drainage, that kind of congested CSF picture I mentioned. There may also be a component of lymphatic drainage compromise, where that's yet another fluid. We already know that there's a pretty complex web of lymphatic vessels in the brain and around the brain. And chances are there's a congestive picture there too that's contributing to this. And then also decreased venous compliance, which may partly be a function of radiation exposure. We normally see decreased venous compliance, which is a fancy way of saying aging of blood vessels. We see that with normal aging, but it happens faster in space, probably for a variety of reasons. But anyway, so with that, maybe I'll pause here. There are lots more conditions that we could talk about, but I'll pause here. And if we have time later, we can come back to it. So thanks, everybody. Happy to take questions.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go for it, Nick.
I was just curious how many of these problems might be helped or solved possibly if you spin the spacecraft to simulate gravity.
Yeah, so I wish that spinning the spacecraft were a very simple, easy, like slam dunk solution. But there are a lot of variables there, and it's interesting because we can say, oh yeah, well, let's just create 1G, let's just solve the problem that way. But that buys us a whole bunch more things that we need to deal with, because it's not just, as any astrodynamicist can vouch, right? Because all of a sudden you're adding in a new component to the bigger picture, to the bigger orbital dynamics picture, by adding that kind of torque component. But beyond that, assuming we had that whole thing figured out, the question becomes, okay, what would the prescription be? What's the gravity RX? How much gravity do we need? Does it need to be a full 1G like on Earth? Or can we get away with 0.8 G? I've got an image on a couple slides later, actually, of some of the exercises that folks do when they're on the International Space Station that are intended to try to mitigate some of the risks and some of the changes that we see. And one of the devices is a treadmill that you put a belt on and you kind of chain yourself to. It's like a medieval torture device kind of deal, but it's effective, and it generates about 0.8 G. And so it gives folks something to run against, so they can stave off some of those bony changes, not all of them, but some of the bony changes and some of the muscle atrophy. And so that's I bring that up as that's been an opportunity for us to get somewhat of a sense of what a prescription might look like, but we don't know for sure yet. So there's a lot more testing, a lot more research that's going to need to be done to figure out and to really get it dialed in. It's not a science quite yet.
Yeah, this is more me as a science fiction person, because the rotating spacecraft is like canon almost, right? It's got to be in there somewhere. Do you think that's actually ever going to happen, or do you think these workarounds like treadmills and other devices to stave off some of these problems are ultimately going to be easier and more effective?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I wish I knew the answer as far as like when we can anticipate an artificial gravity component to be realistically ready to fly. There certainly are folks working on it, not just in this country, but elsewhere around the world, because that would potentially mitigate issues related to bone loss, muscle atrophy, vision issues, fluid shifts, and the fluid shifts, create kidney problems, like I mentioned, and you have astronauts with kidney stones, which are ultimately really problematic, and a whole host of other things. So yeah, I mean, even just from the biochemical or the biomedical perspective, that would be incredible, but I'm not sure when that would really happen. I do know folks are working on it, so fingers crossed.
Just glad to hear that the great wheel in the sky is at least still a possibility.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Hope it happens. So, anybody else have a question?
My face feels like puffy just listening to you talk. I was like sitting here like, oh my gosh. So you said the fluid in the head, that's reversible when they come back down the well, as we say. I was wondering, the vision stuff, I knew the vision deteriorates when they're in the microgravity environment, but does that reverse when you come back into gravity?
So thus far, some of the changes that we've seen have been reversible, and some of the changes have been very sluggish in reversing, especially on some of the longer duration missions that folks have been conducting more recently. It's, the recovery process is ongoing. So, there is gradual improvement, but I think in several circumstances, the crew member has yet to really regain full, the full amount of vision loss that they had lost when they were actually in flight. So what's interesting is that I think, and if you consider one of the other exercises that we have folks do right now on the ISS is resistive, and it's using this device called the ARED, Advanced Resistive Exercise Device. And it's basically like a leg press where, but it's a full body exercise machine. And when you push in the way that you need to push to use that machine, you actually increase the pressure inside your head. So one of the theories, and I didn't mention this on the SANS page, but one of the theories is that maybe that device isn't such a great idea. Maybe we're fixing one problem where, we're encouraging, their muscles to stay strong. We're maybe mitigating some of the bone loss related issues, but maybe we're actually creating a problem with vision or worsening a problem that would naturally occur anyway. So, again, still more work to be done. And it's great that now that the commercial spaceflight arena has been burgeoning in the way that it has been, we're going to have lots more research subjects, hopefully. So fingers crossed that it keeps going that way.
Oh, this sounds like a pretty thorny problem.
Yeah.
If you had to guess on a time frame of when it would be feasible for us to go to Mars, not technology wise on the spacecraft side, but on the human impacts of being in space side, what would you say?
When do I think that medically we're going to be ready?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, it's really just it ultimately is a question of how much risk a crew member is willing to accept, And I think the bottom line is once the capabilities are to such a point, for sending a crew to Mars and back, once those capabilities are there on the engineering side, I don't think it's going to be hard to find crew members that are chomping at the bit to go.
That's true.
Yeah. I think folks, yeah, exactly. Put me in, coach. So it's kind of
are you on that list, Danny?
Yeah, for sure. It's it's one of those things where I think folks are so committed to this process and to the future of human spaceflight and exploration that folks are willing to accept that kind of risk. But certainly the onus is on, folks like me and many other docs that are looking at these kinds of things to say, okay, given that, and given that there are folks who are ready to go, like, how do we make sure that they are kept as safe as possible within, with the understanding being that it's an inherently dangerous environment. Excuse me. So,
Yeah, makes sense.
Penny, I think I heard you talk about the following in one of the other presentations you gave for Wyoming Stargazing a while back, but prophylactic appendectomies.
Yeah.
Going to Mars. Like, is that going to be like the standard for astronauts going to Mars, do you think, or optional? Or?
The jury's still out. So I'm the president of the Space Surgery Association, which we formed a couple years ago. And I was elected president back in May. And we actually gave a panel with a series of presentations. And one of the topics that we looked at and this is just like a couple of weeks ago at the Aerospace Medical Association conference, but one of the topics that we looked at really closely and we gave different perspectives on, I think it was 3 people who presented in that segment, is this exact question, because there still are some countries in the world like Australia and New Zealand actually require prophylactic appendectomies for any physicians who travel to Antarctica. So if they want to go to Antarctica, with the understanding being that when you winter over in Antarctica, you are there, you are not going anywhere for at least 6 months usually. So if you happen to develop appendicitis and you're the only doc that's there, not only does that take you out, but then it potentially endangers the rest of the folks that are there with you. And it compromises your ability to do your job. So that rule exists in that setting, just among those 2 countries, to my knowledge. But there are some folks that feel that it would be wise to establish a rule like that going to Mars and back. There are others that feel differently. And I'll tell you that when I was down, I spent a month at Johnson Space Center and I was at the very end of medical school. And we looked at that question and we actually used, through XMC, used their integrated medical model, like modeling system, this like big database, and crunched the numbers and figured out what the risk of developing appendicitis versus the risk of developing a small bowel obstruction from prophylactic surgery and scar tissue, what we call adhesions, inside the belly, like what those 2 competing risks were to figure out if it made sense to operate, prophylactically or not. And at the end of the day, it was kind of a wash. And so then we said, all right, well, if it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other, that's not even considering the ethical implications of telling somebody you must undergo surgery that you may or may not actually need, or you can't go to space, So I think, it's all that to say, it's a complicated question. My inclination is to say probably not necessary, but we'll see how it evolves. So.
Well, mine's already gone, so I'm good to go.
There you go. You're ready.
I also wanted to make note, I saw on that list of ailments down at the very bottom right-hand corner, something that just made me chuckle. It said altitude sickness.
Yeah.
That's about as high as you can get when you're.
It's true. It's true. So we see, there are a lot of issues with hypobarics, with and hyperbarics, like with differing changes in pressure, because even though, we currently, the folks that engineer and that design all of the spacecraft that we've used up to now have tried to essentially target an environment like an inside the cabin environment that is as close as possible to what we experience here. So kind of like standard temperature and pressure, targeting about 14.7 psi, with like a gaseous breakdown that's approximately equivalent to what we're breathing on Earth when we breathe normal air. But when you're getting ready to go on EVA, for example, on a spacewalk, there's a depressurization period that you have to undergo. And so that's where you're like pre-breathing O2, because you're going to be at a different pressurization level when you're actually in the spacesuit. So there's a transition period required. And so you're dealing with the same physiology when you're going from one pressure level to another pressure level. And so it's essentially like simulated altitudes, or simulated altitude change. Folks don't necessarily think about it that way when they think about it originally, but that's the net effect as far as what the body's experiencing.
So you're saying inside the ISS, it's effectively sea level pressure. Inside the spacesuit, what's the effective pressure then?
Yeah, I can look that up and I can let you know. I'm a little embarrassed that
I'm
I don't
also
have
a
that
little bit
number on the
surprised.
tip.
It seems like in the spacecraft, you do what they do in aircraft, right? Which is depressurized to effectively a higher altitude. That's easier for the engineers to solve.
Well, but when you're talking about keeping folks healthy, because it's one thing to have, usually the cabin altitude on, let's say, an airline flight is capped at about 8,000 feet. And it's one thing to say, okay, yeah, we'll put you at 8,000 feet for like an hour or 3 hours or 10 hours, but 10 months, a year is a little bit of a different story.
Well,
Yeah.
people live up there.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. So, I think there's still some work to be done to like really get it dialed in, especially given all the other considerations, making sure that the CO2 scrubbers are working to reduce the amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere, in there as well. So lots of considerations. It's not just the pressure piece, but yeah, so that's where that whole altitude sickness thing comes in. But anyway.
Cool. Thanks for speaking to that. Let's move along to astro advice. So tonight's theme is human spaceflight. And so we have a quotation from Mae Jemison, who's a physician, engineer, and was the first Black woman to travel in space as a crew specialist on the Endeavour space shuttle. And she said that once I got into space, I was feeling very comfortable in the universe. I felt like I had a right to be anywhere in this universe, that I belonged here as much as any speck of stardust, any comet, any planet. There's a picture of her up there now. I just thought that was kind of a cool way to talk about an experience in space for one human that I just hadn't heard anyone say it quite like that before. So I found that appealing. And I've had the pleasure of talking with several astronauts over the years, and they've all related some kind of breakthrough experience when they see the Earth as a one sphere isolated in space from everything else, when they actually see that curvature of the Earth flying over it and are looking down from it from afar. And I think that's actually one of the coolest things about what the commercial spaceflight industry is doing right now, giving more people that opportunity to have that experience. And right now it's just a chosen few and the multi-billionaires, but eventually it could be folks like us. And I think the more humans that actually get that experience, probably the better for humanity.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's called the overview effect, if I recall correctly. And I think with one thing I will be interested to see is, like you said, with this kind of new area of more people and a wider range of people going into space, how much that will persist, because I feel like astronauts are such a selective group, right? Like they're not your average Joe off the street. And I just I'm curious to see what the range of reactions will be for people that haven't had dedicated a large portion of their life to culminating in this space flight. But I like this quote, and I think that it's kind of like the opposite side of the coin of sometimes we feel very insignificant in the universe because we are just a little tiny planet in this one solar system out in the one of the small arms of the Milky Way, which is just one of billions of galaxies. Even though we're tiny, we're here, and we know that we're here, and I think that's pretty cool. So yeah, I like this quote.
Yeah, it made me think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Nick. Go ahead. I'll go later.
All right. Yeah, I think what was I gonna say? The perspective of human spaceflight. There's a little bit of coming from the astronomy perspective of, wow, we could really buy a lot of telescopes with that, but it's really not to underestimate both the the scientific interest we can get in having humans in space and seeing obviously what happens to us up there and how viable that is, but also the psychological aspect of it, not just from the people who are able to go to space, but all of us down here to think of that as a possibility, and to be able to identify with people like this, with astronauts, and see their journeys and that kind of impact. That's pretty powerful to how that affects hopefully humanity and our vision going forward.
Yeah, I was going to add, actually, Nora, it made me think, when I read this quote earlier, it made me think of the overview effect too. That was the first thought that I had. And then, yeah, it really is kind of the inverse of that. So, talking about how, yes, we are little specks, but we're still here and we're still a part of this bigger picture, which is kind of beautiful. So I love this quote, actually. This one, and then there's a really great quote from Neil Armstrong, actually, that I used to have on one of the doorways in my apartment in medical school, which was, "Every human has a finite number of heartbeats. I don't intend to waste any of mine." So it's a similar kind of idea, I guess. It's like, even though we're a tiny part of the bigger picture, it's not totally insignificant. So
Who was it that said, so I know Carl Sagan was like, "We are stardust," but I can't remember if it was him or someone else, but said that we are stardust that knows itself. And I think that's really kind of a very special thing. And I like that idea.
Yeah, I think that was Carl Sagan as well. I think what it was
Not
was
surprising.
we are the universe knowing itself. But yeah, I really love Mae Jemison's sentiment of belonging to the greater universe. And I think that cosmic perspective is really important. Like, regardless of whether any of us actually get to go into space, but actually having this like broad cosmic perspective that we actually like really are a part of the entire cosmos, and that it really took the entire cosmos and several billion years for us to get here, to actually have, an Earth with living things on it that know they're living things and are part of the universe. I think that's what she's hearkening back to with that sense of belonging, and I think that's pretty cool. So we're gonna go into a virtual stargazing segment right now. We connected with our local virtual stargazer, Dr. Mike Adler, last week, and he took some pictures using his telescope and camera and gave us some commentary on them. So we're going to roll that for you, and then we'll come back and we're going to share some clips of the Inspiration 4 mission, because first completely. I just dropped the word I was looking for. Civilian, thank you. I was like, commercial. No, it's not the first commercial flight. Civilian. Thanks, Nora. The first totally civilian space flight, which is pretty cool. So enjoy the virtual stargazing video, and we'll be back just after that, and we'll check out some of the Inspiration 4 clips. We'll be right back.
Hi there, my name is Mike Adler. I'm Vice President of Wyoming Stargazing, and I'm also a PhD from MIT in 1971. I worked in solid state physics. Now I'm retired. I worked for GE for about 30 years, having nothing to do with astronomy either. And but I'm now in Jackson, live here. I have my own observatory, and I'm going to show you that observatory. It was built in 2014. It has 3 telescopes in it, a 6-inch refractor, which actually I used for very large objects in the sky, a 12.5-inch reflecting type telescope, and a 20-inch or a half a meter telescope, which we're going to use tonight to be looking at 3 different objects using that telescope. I should mention that I'm going to stop the sharing for a second. I should mention that it is the 19th of September, and it's about 9 o'clock at night, just after when the sky has gotten dark. Fortunately, it happens earlier this time of year as we're going into. Hi there, my name is Mike Adler. I'm Vice President of Wyoming Stargazing, and I'm also a PhD from MIT in 1971. I worked in solid state physics. Now I'm retired. I worked for GE for about 30 years, having nothing to do with astronomy either. And but I'm now in Jackson, live here. I have my own observatory, and I'm going to show you that observatory. It was built in 2014. It has 3 telescopes in it, a 6-inch refractor, which actually I used for very large objects in the sky, a 12.5-inch reflecting type telescope, and a 20-inch or a half a meter telescope, which we're going to use tonight to be looking at 3 different objects using that telescope. I should mention that it's I'm going to stop the sharing for a second. I should mention that it is the 19th of September, and it's about 9 o'clock at night, just after when the sky has gotten dark. Fortunately, it happens earlier this time of year as we're going into fall. So the first object we're going to look at is the Andromeda Galaxy, and that's what it is. It's my backdrop here. So I'm going to take a quick picture of it to show you, to see what it looks like in a very, almost like through an eyepiece or a very short exposure. So we're going to share the screen. I'm going to go to the program that controls the camera on the telescope. And there's the picture. I just took it, and it's it is of the center part of the Andromeda Galaxy. And the Andromeda has several interesting features about it, that it is the nearest neighbor large galaxy to ours. It's about twice the size of ours, holding almost a trillion stars. One of the interesting features of the Andromeda is that it was ended a debate that was going on about 100 years ago, which was how far away things are. And people thought things like this and all sorts of other objects were in our Milky Way and were relatively close to us. Well, that really didn't have any idea, because there was no way really to measure distance. So this woman called Henrietta Swan Leavitt at Harvard found out that a certain type of star called a Cepheid variable star, its absolute brightness was proportional to the frequency that it varied. And so if by measuring the frequency, you could figure out how bright it actually was, and then by measuring its apparent brightness, you could figure out how far away it was. And Hubble found one of these Cepheid stars in the Andromeda, and he was able to figure out that the Andromeda was millions of light years away compared with all the other stuff that people were looking at, which were thousands and tens of thousands of light years away, really, and showing that this was a galaxy much like our own galaxy, the Milky Way. So I'm going to end this right now and just show you this. So I get out of the way, but this is my image of the Andromeda taken with my 6-inch telescope that allows me to put the whole field of view. It's about 6 moon diameters in size. I should also mention that all the stars you're seeing in this picture and on the other one were not stars in the Andromeda. They're all in our galaxy, and we're looking past them to the Andromeda. These 2 big things are actually other galaxies that are orbiting and gravitationally bound to the Andromeda. So we'll now move on to the next object, and I'm going to show you first the program that controls the telescope. So here's this is called SkyX, and it controls the position of my telescope. Right now it's pointing at the Andromeda, which is way up here in the northern northeast part of our sky. And we're going to go to something that's actually almost directly overhead, Messier 27. So I'm going to enter M27 here, and then I'm going to ask it to find it, and there it is, the red. And now I'm going to tell the telescope to move. And so it's going to move to it, but it can't go directly to it. It actually, because of the nature of this mount, it has to flop from one side to the other to get to it. So it's going right by the North Star, the Polaris, and it's now going to be coming down and will shortly join M27. Now, I'll say a little bit about M27. It's a nebula in our galaxy. It's called the Dumbbell Nebula, and it's the remnant of a sun-like star. So a star like the sun, after it burns all through its hydrogen, creating helium, it will then compress the helium, and it'll start another nuclear reaction where the helium is converted into carbon. But then when it burns through all of that, which is going to happen in about 4 billion years, it's not going to be able to heat that carbon hot enough, and so the thing is going to disappear. The sun will stop doing nuclear reactions and will gradually effervesce away, leaving a small remnant of itself called a white dwarf. So I'm going to show you a picture of that, and that's we'll go back to the program that does controls the cameras on the and here we are. So this is a picture of a very short picture of M27, and it's called the Dumbbell Nebula because of this shape. So this was once all this gas and all was once part of a star. And what's left of the star is that little pinprick up there, which is a very dense star. And it's an electron degenerate star, very high, very small, and very highly packed. Not as packed as dense as a neutron star, but pretty tight. And this is several light years in size, much larger than even our solar system, which is just a tiny fraction of a light year. So the star is going to expand to a much larger area once it stops being an active star. So now we're going to go to the next object, and I'm going to go back to the computer this program that controls the telescope, SkyX. And now we're going to go to the third object, which is Messier 16. Now this is the object M27, which is just about right overhead. That's what this line is. But we're going to go to M16, which is the Eagle Nebula, and it's gradually disappearing. It's in the summer Milky Way, and we're not going to be seeing it too much longer. And it's kind of pretty low in the sky. So I'm now going to tell it the telescope now is going to be able to go directly to it. It's not going to have to flip because it's already on the right side of the mount to go to this object. And so you can see it's going there. We'll get there fairly fast because it's not too far away. So this object is about 30 degrees above the horizon, but it's sinking, and as the weeks go by, we won't be able to see it again. So now I'll show you what this object looks like, and go back to the screen controlling the camera, and we'll move this one away. And here's the object of M16. Now M16 is called the Eagle Nebula. It's very famous for several reasons. One is beautiful. It's an emission nebula, so this cluster of stars is causing the gas and dust here to be excited into a higher, or the gas in particular, to be excited into a higher energy state. And in particular, hydrogen gas, which is most of what is here, will get excited and then re-emit the light, and that's what this cloud looks like. Now, there are several features in this nebula that are worth noting. This one feature is called the Pillars of Creation, that was made famous by the Hubble. And there's another one called the Fairy of the Eagle Nebula, and Fairy of the Eagle, and that's down here. I took a very close picture of this myself last year, and 67 hours. And it actually is not as good as the Hubble image, but it's actually it comes reasonably close. This is a 30-second image, 30-second picture where that thing took me 67 hours. Now we're going to, that's all the telescoping that we're going to do tonight, but I wanted to show you one more object because it's kind of cool. And it was, I just took it a couple days, but not nights, but this is of the sun. And so here you see a picture of the sun, and it was taken on the 17th at around 6 p.m., fairly low in the sky. But you can see these amazing prominences, and and these are what all the surface features you're seeing here are called filaments. They're interactions of the heat flow coming from the center of the sun with the magnetic fields. But some of these things, the interaction is so strong, it causes the gas to be blown up off the surface. Now, some of these may actually look like this, but we're looking at them face on. So we see the prominences are the ones that are on the edge. And these are huge. These things are as over 6 times the Earth's diameter above the surface of the sun. And the sun is the surface of the sun is only 6,000 degrees Kelvin. So it feels fairly warm, but it doesn't compare to the 15 million degrees of Kelvin in the middle of the sun, which is creating the nuclear reactions that's providing ultimately all the heat and light. So that's all I'm going to say tonight, and I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll pick this up again in a couple of weeks, maybe.
Welcome back, everybody. We've got some clips of the Inspiration-4 mission to share with you now. If you don't already know, the first full civilian spaceflight just happened and ended. Totally successful, and there was some great footage of both the liftoff, the crew and the capsule doing some fun human tricks for us, and then splashdown and them emerging from the capsule, not on like stretchers, as happened to the first couple of crew members that came out. I think of like the very first astronauts brought up to the ISS, but these folks, they step right out and they're like walking around, which I thought was pretty cool. So we'll play these clips for you, and then share a few more words about human spaceflight, and then we'll wrap it up. So enjoy the footage.
Copy, 1 Alpha.
Vehicles pitching downrange. Gauge 1 propulsion is nominal.
T plus 30 seconds. Callouts indicate nominal. Historic mission flying the Inspiration-4 crew on board Dragon and Falcon 9. Great view of the crew in the capsule.
Everybody to Crew Dragon Resilience. We're cruising right now at 580 kilometers above the Earth, going about 7.6 kilometers per second. So we're really booking. We're seeing the world every 90 minutes. That's how fast we're traveling around it. It's pretty incredible. So we're excited you're here to join us today. We're going to introduce the crew of Inspiration-4, and then we're going to show you around some of the cool aspects about this spacecraft we're on right now. So pass.
Hey everyone, I'm Chris Dombrowski. I'm the mission specialist here, and we've been doing a lot of great things here, like looking out the window at Earth, just like we're going to show you through the cupola in a moment. And I hope we get to share other cool things like some of the medical experiments and some of the more human side of things that we've brought up here into space with us today. So pass it on over.
Hi everyone, I'm Cyan Proctor and I am the mission pilot, and I hope to show you some of the art that I've been doing in a little bit.
Hey guys, thanks for joining us here on Crew Dragon. My name is Haley Arsenault. I'm the medical officer of the mission, and excited to show you about the research that we've been doing, as well as how much fun it is to be in microgravity. So one of the most fun parts of being in space is microgravity, or this lack of gravity that has enabled us to do all kinds of cool flips and spins. I shall demonstrate a few, if I can not run into too many walls.
Haley is a champ at spinning. She's been spinning from the moment we got on orbit.
I have to say it's a lot of fun and enables us to lift really heavy things without any issue.
And there she is. Medical Officer Haley Arsenault has now egressed the vehicle, the first of the Inspiration-4 crew, and so very excited. Lots of waves, thumbs up.
Thumbs up. And here comes Dr. Cyan Proctor.
And there she is, excited as ever. Dr. Cyan Proctor. Oh, I love it.
And that is Chris Dombrowski, again, the mission specialist.
There he is. Commander Jared Isaacman of the Inspiration 4 crew. So excited.
All right. I mean, I just think it's totally cool that they can just like walk right out of that capsule and just move around as well as they have. I mean, like I've like heard stories of how disorienting it is getting back into gravity. So I was incredibly impressed with how well they all seem to be maneuvering around fresh out of the capsule.
A lot of that had to do with the fact that it was a really short mission. So from a neurovestibular perspective, it wasn't quite as challenging for their bodies to readapt versus if they had been up, you know, in space for like months. It's a much heavier lift for your nervous system.
It looked, they were like positioned there to catch them, right?
Yep. And actually, I think Jared Isaacman was a little bit woozy. You could see in that last clip.
Yeah, I think a couple of them looked a little unsteady, but still very cool that they were able to walk. I thought when I was watching the clip and they were talking about microgravity, and I realized I was thinking this earlier too, but we talk a lot about, you know, weightlessness and microgravity, 0G, and the physicist in me has to clarify, gravity does not shut off at the height that these people are orbiting. Gravity, the Earth still has a gravity field and they're still affected by their gravity field. But the key is that they are in orbit around the Earth. They're basically falling around the Earth at the same rate that the Earth is pulling them by gravity. So that's a distinction about the physics of what's happening, but it is equivalent to not having gravity.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that, Nora. People ask me that a lot when we start talking about space flight out on the stargazing programs, and they're always like incredibly surprised that there is gravity up on the International Space Station. Most folks just don't understand that. Yeah, anything orbiting something else is really just falling, just like the moon. It just never hits. Hopefully not.
That'd be a bad day.
Danny, they mentioned they were doing some medical experiments up there. Do you know what they were doing?
I do, yeah. So one of the, let's see, there are a series of them. One was actually focused specifically on ultrasound, and actually some of the folks that I work with. So I should back up. There's an organization, like this research organization called TRISH, the Translational Research Institute for Space Health, excuse me, is the larger research entity that supported all of the research that was done on Inspiration 4. So some of the interviews that were done earlier in the like TV broadcast were actually folks that I have meetings with on a weekly basis. They're friends of mine. So it was neat to see, and they were talking about some of the stuff that we collectively and collaboratively are working on. So like choosing different technologies to fly and stuff to be able to facilitate these medical tests. So it was pretty neat. But so they brought an ultrasound machine, a Butterfly IQ, which is it's really slick. I've actually got one, but it's like it connects directly to your phone. So you can plug it in and you can see ultrasound images on your iPhone screen, for example, instead of needing to have the big bulky thing that we usually use in the hospital. So that was pretty cool. And that was to look at some of the ocular changes that happened. And then also they were looking at some fluid shifts. And they may have been looking at the neck as well. I don't know if that was part of their research protocol. They did some cognitive tests and some like balance related tests to check not just balance, on Earth, but also proprioception and their ability to kind of gauge in 3D space what their movements were, because there's like an adaptation period for your coordination and whatnot, like motor coordination and everything. So I know that they were looking at that. Let's see, I think there were some baseline psych related evals. but I don't remember what instrument they were using specifically for that, like what surveys. And I don't remember what else. I think there were a couple of other things that were used on there. Oh, I think some pretty basic blood work was done, and with the plan of like running those tests back when they got, on the ground. So yeah, but it'll be neat to see. And so all that data is going to be banked, and then it won't be released for like research purposes until there are enough people who've flown that it can realistically be anonymous, because you start getting into some pretty tricky ethical issues there. But that's part of what Trish is navigating, and that's some of what I've gotten to be involved in. So
I feel like those psych evals must be very important, because I think like when we're talking, it was one of the things on the list, right, about a mission to Mars, the isolation and confinement. And I just feel like, so I used to be in the Navy, and if we were out to sea for too long at a time, we'd have what's called a beer day. So like if you're out to sea, I forget now, it's been a long time, the number of days, but if you're out to sea without pulling into port, you get basically a beer or two from your command as like a, hey, blow off some steam, this sucks. And that's like on a ship at sea where like you can go outside and see the sun like anytime you want. So I feel like just it's got to be so hard mentally to think about a trip to Mars in a spaceship with however many other people that you probably would want to kill after like 2 days.
Now I'm just hoping that trip to Mars make sure they plan in some beer days as well.
They better plan some beer days. That's what it's very
They definitely do have days off. What was that? Sorry.
So the beer days are very important.
I can't vouch.
Great beer.
I can't vouch for the presence of any alcohol on there, but they certainly do have days off.
Come on, some astronaut has smuggled a little flask.
Oh gosh.
That was an XKCD joke. They were talking about the number of harpoons in space because of the one that was trying to harpoon a comet. I just remember that because I think there was a liquor called Harpoon. That was the other one that'd been in space. Anyway, random reference, but I'm sure it's been done.
Yeah, I would be shocked if there hasn't been some experimentation about the effects of alcohol in microgravity. Science,
official or otherwise.
Yeah, official or otherwise.
Maybe on the Russian side.
Yeah, right, yeah.
So.
Blame it on the Russians, of course, in their corridor of the ISS. Well, we're over time as we normally are, which is fantastic. Just means we have a lot of good stuff to talk about. Any closing thoughts before we wrap things up this evening? All right. Well, sorry, Noah, go for it.
Oh, I just was going to be kind of cheesy and be like, this picture that we have here of, the American flag on the moon and astronauts there. I was just thinking about this the other day because I was just making a series about the moon, but there are only 12 people ever in the history of mankind that have ever walked on a body other than Earth, and that body was the moon. And like, I think growing up, like it was just a fact, right? Like, oh yeah, we went to the moon back in the 60s and 70s. And now that we're coming up on the prospect of sending people back to the moon, the Artemis mission, sending women to the moon, which is very exciting to me because it is all men, and I think all white men have done this. I just like taking a moment to be like, we did that and we're going to do it again. And we might do it with Mars. Like, this is fucking sci-fi people. Sorry, this is sci-fi people. Like, it's amazing. Just like, I don't know, just take a second and appreciate it.
I could not agree more. It's so exciting. And like the exploration component of it, it's this one big adventure with, just pushing humanity forward. It's so exciting.
Yeah. And I think that really is the biggest reason to complement what Elon Musk and Richard Branson and Bezos are doing. They really are pushing the envelope of what humanity is capable of. And I think for no other reason, they deserve some accolades for that, because yeah, it is entering like a sci-fi era. And that's the really cool thing about science, and especially space science. So much science fiction has become science. And that's actually a great segue just to mention one of our special guests coming up in a couple weeks. It's not this next one, but later in October, we've got Miguel Alcubierre, who designed the first warp drive. So we're going to actually get to find out what real sci-fi is going to look like down the pipe in, you know, maybe several hundred years or so. But yeah, what's going on this decade and the upcoming years is also really, really exciting. Definitely worth some F-bombs.
Sorry. Like I said, I was in the Navy.
I always click the not made for kids on YouTube when we upload it. So we're safe. We can do that
You
here.
get Gavin on the beep.
All right. Well, always thanks to all the co-stars for being here, as well as our virtual stargazers in the background, Gavin, our stream master, and everybody else who makes the Cosmos show possible, and all of you who are watching the shows. We appreciate you paying attention, and we hope you're having a good time watching us have a good time. So until the next show in a couple weeks, be well, and don't forget to look up. We'll see you next time. See ya.